welcome to the International Code Council Region 1 and Region 1 Radio Show. My name is Tim Spears. I'm the host of Region 1 Radio. Region 1 was established in 2014 and we're made up of 3 states, California, Nevada, and Hawaii. That also includes many ICC chapters. We are dedicated to excellence in education and engagement to promote a safer environment by bringing individuals together. Our podcast aims to provide valuable information and insights to professionals in the building and fire safety industry. We cover a wide range of topics, such as industry updates, best practices, and we interview experts in the field. We also aim to engage our listeners by discussing many relevant topics. Whether you're a code official, a building inspector, architect, engineer, or someone that's interested in the building and fire safety industry, our podcast is for you. We believe by bringing individuals together to share knowledge and resources, we promote a building safety environment and contribute to the betterment of our communities. So if you want to stay informed and up to date on the latest developments in the building safety industry, be sure to tune in to ICC Region 1 Radio. In this episode, I spoke with Ray Obronke from the American Wood Council. We discussed the critical topic of fire safety during new construction. We discussed the challenges of fire safety education and enforcement, the importance of a comprehensive fire safety plan, and the role of fire prevention program managers. The conversation also covers the perception of fire safety and the potential risk of complacency during new construction, the use of a temporary fire alarm system, and then also the management of temporary systems on the job site. We conclude the episode by a discussion on how to improve construction fire safety, emphasizing the enforcement of existing building and fire codes and standards, and the different resources available for fire marshals' offices and building departments. Ray, welcome to ICC Region 1 Radio. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a good conversation, good topic to discuss. As you and I were just kind of talking briefly before we started, some of the recent events in the headlines as of late, construction fire safety and really fire safety in general has definitely been a hot topic, and I think that this would be a good conversation to be able to share with our membership, and then also be able to share with building and fire safety professionals, nationwide, even globally, because I think that there are a lot of elements to, the code, but even the standard that many people aren't aware of, and so I think that have this conversation is going to be a good, for me, even doing the research leading up to this was good, a kind of a good reminder of some of those things that I need to start implementing in my practice as a fire marshal here. So, but welcome. So you're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, so a little bit of a time difference, but it's definitely summer, so the sun is out. So. But first, let's start with your background. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about your background? And then I know that you currently are with the American Wood Council, so what your role is with them as well?
I am with the American Wood Council. I'm their manager of fire service relations. So basically, I'm the wood industry's rep to the American Fire Service. So I provide all their fire service education. I sit on several committees, including NFPA 241, which is a standard I think you were talking about earlier. Yep. I'm also on the IFC committee. And so that's what I do presently. But for 23 years, I was with the Baltimore City Fire Department. I was the fire marshal for Baltimore City. I retired as the assistant chief of the department. Then I went to be the chief building official for the city of Rockville, Maryland, which is a small but affluent city right outside of D.C. So I come at this from both a fire official background and building official background, and now as an industry rep.
How was that transition from being a fire code official, being in the fire service, and then into the chief building official? How was that transition? I know that some have, tried to wear the dual hats, and sometimes it does become quite challenging, but maybe I don't hear of too many people transitioning from the fire service and then into the building safety side of things.
And that was actually one of the reasons the American Wood Council wanted to hire me, because they wanted somebody with a codes background and also a fire background and a fire suppression background. So it's actually it's almost tailor-made for this topic. and I'll explain why when we get into some of the challenges
Yeah.
coming at it from building side and a fire side.
Yeah, I mean that definitely helps with, I'm sure, the diversity and knowledge and being able to get. And one of the things that I've seen in my research leading up to today's discussion, that it really takes not only just the fire service but also the building side of things and the building safety and the building official, along with the general contractor and the construction companies, to be able to make this really work and make it work well. So, uh, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
ultimately, the responsibility for construction fire safety rests with the owner. It will
Yeah.
always rest with the owner. Now, the enforcement of it rests with the building and fire departments in conjunction with each other, which unfortunately doesn't always happen.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of collaboration and a lot of working together and many discussions across many different entities. And I know that it's one of those things that we're starting to see. The construction industry, there are a lot of unique things that are happening. From my area, we're building a lot of logistics and storage facilities and warehouses. We have your large e-commerce businesses that are in town, and they definitely implement a lot of new technology that may also pose risks and those types of things. I've even had some where they have some automation where they have an electrified rail that we have to work through, and when does that get electrified during the course of construction and all of that. So but what kind of key changes or key challenges and risks do you see associated with fire safety during building construction? Because there are a lot. We talk, there's things like hot work and combustible materials, but what are some of those key challenges that you see on your side of things?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge is just getting the education out there to builders and developers. They don't realize that there are codes that safeguard construction, that govern how a building is to be kept fire safe during construction. And ultimately, too many people, both in the fire service, building department, and industry in general, think that these buildings, because they are under construction, because the wiring usually is temporary, that they get a mulligan, they get a pass. They don't have to store hazmats as per NFPA standards. They don't have to follow, say, Chapter 33 of the IFC. So the biggest challenge is education gap. The second biggest challenge is what I call an enforcement gap. Um, the enforcement gap is between the building and the fire side, and it comes from the traditional roles of building inspectors and fire inspectors.
Hmm.
And building inspector, they grow up in a culture that says you go on site, you look at the approved plans, you enforce the MEP codes, you make sure it's built per the approved plans. The fire side, it's a maintenance code. The fire code is a
Hmm.
maintenance code. Fire
Yep.
departments usually don't get into a construction site until it's almost finished, if
Right.
they get into it all before it's finished. So the building side is going, hey, the fire code, fire safety, that's the fire inspector's job. And the
Hmm.
fire inspectors say, we inspect finished buildings. You
Right.
know, that's the building inspector's job. And it's not that either side is being lazy or neglectful. They just are retreating into their traditional roles. And
Hmm.
in the gap between what the fire official and the building official thinks is their responsibility and enforcement, builders aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing during
Yeah.
construction. Um, so I think that's a big challenge. Also, construction managers are not paid to keep a construction site fire safe. They are not paid to keep a clean construction site. They're getting
Hmm.
paid bonuses for coming in under budget, coming in on time, and that kind of thing. So,
Right.
what's the easiest thing to let go? You get more people swinging hammers and less people cleaning up. So you get a lot of combustible debris around
Yeah.
these construction sites, and they usually happen off hours. So a small fire grows into a large fire before it's discovered. So what I call a three-legged stool, that you need early notification, you need adequate water supply, and you need fire department access. And one of the common themes of all these construction site fires is one of these three are missing.
Hmm.
What good is water supply if you don't have access? What good is access if the fire is already too far gone? And
Right.
site security has become bigger more important nowadays too, because
Yeah.
the amount of intentionally set fires is trending
Yep.
upward.
So, as we talk about the kind of the three-legged stool, but maybe going back to the gaps that you see in the education piece and then also the enforcement piece, I even think you kind of mentioned it too, a mindset gap, being able to change the mindset of those that are actually out on the construction site. So, going back to maybe the education piece, because I think that in the fire service we always focus a lot on education. How do we educate more of those people to be able to reduce the risk in the entire community, in construction, new construction sites included? So, what recommendations do you have to maybe help bridging that gap between, what's out there and what is needed of business owners and building owners?
Well, the place to do it is during the pre-construction meeting. That
Hmm.
is the best place, place to manage their expectations, to let them know this is what we expect, how the job is to be kept, and you would go over things like housekeeping, on-site
Hmm.
security, storage of building materials, that kind of thing, training of employees. So that all should be managed at the beginning of the before the project even is approved and starts.
Right.
That's the best place to put that. Now, the challenge from a fire department or point of view, or a fire marshal's office point of view, is the way inspections are conducted.
Hmm.
Inspections are either permit driven or they're complaint driven, and there
Yeah.
is no permit for construction sites. So unless someone picks up a phone and calls, a fire department would have no reason to even go on site. It may not even know that the construction is even occurring.
Yeah, yeah. I know that we have new construction permits, but a lot of times, as you mentioned, a lot of times we may not get out there until the work is ready for us to be able to inspect. So we're not necessarily going out there on a routine basis to be able to check to make sure that they're following their construction safety plan. Because they're, as you mentioned, what's the mandate? We're going out there for typically an operational fire permit if we're going to do annual inspections, but new construction, typically it's kind of, we wait till we get the call. Do you have any suggestions on maybe frequency of inspections, how we can continue to monitor that during this process, especially during the construction phase?
Well, this is where the fire department and the building departments need to communicate. And if the fire departments aren't being invited to the pre-construction meetings, they need to be, or at least they need to have access to the buildings departments, you know, permit database. So whenever a
Hmm.
new building permit is issued, they at least are aware that it's there. But
Hmm.
staffing is an issue. I know that when I was the fire marshal in Baltimore City, my entire fire marshal's office was 60 people at its height, and we barely kept up on just the permit inspections, let alone
Yeah.
going around and looking at construction sites, and usually would only enter them to do pump tests or hydros. And now your building's already, you know,
Yeah.
built, topped out, and buttoned up,
Hmm.
And a lot of these fires occur in buildings that haven't completed their exterior, sheathing that's
Yep.
wide open, and a bunch of studs that are not far from each other, and
Right.
these really breed wind-driven fires.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that orientation of the fuel, right? And you've got it's all exposed combustible framing, or a lot of it is exposed framing. And we're typically not, we might get involved in the frame state a little bit to do a visual inspection of maybe fire sprinklers and those types of things, but they're not necessarily calling us too frequently to be able to do those routine inspections. And now we kind of talk about how that combustible material will pile up over the course of time. And you mentioned earlier it's kind of that mindset of the general contractor, what their ultimate, I don't say goal, but what drives them to get the work done. How do we maybe try to help work on that shift? I think pre-construction meetings are good, but maybe moving forward outside of that as we go and provide that education when we visit the job site.
Well, I know in Montgomery County, Maryland, they created an NFP 241 checklist
Okay.
because Maryland is on NFPA 1. But you could do the same with Chapter 33 of
Hmm.
IFC, and they staple it to the approved plans. So whenever the building inspector goes on site, they can look at that checklist as sort of a visual cue that, hey, you need to be looking at this stuff. It also sends a visual cue to the builders, like these
Hmm.
are the things that have to go on. So I think that's probably the easiest way. But if you just follow the IFC, or you force them to follow the IFC, they are supposed to have a daily self-inspection.
Mm,
They're supposed to walk the property inside and out, the entire property, every day, and keep documentation of that. Okay, so that would essentially be a Chapter 33 construction fire safety checklist, and they
right.
actually list everything that needs to be on that. And they have to keep these records. And if the building or fire official requests them, they need to show them to the official. And if after 3 times they don't produce it, you can issue a stop work order until you've
Yeah.
gained satisfactory assurances of future compliance.
Well, and I noticed one of the there was I think city of Boston. They have an NFPA 241 like affidavit that they have everybody sign according at least looking at the website, and they mention that a possible stop work order notice if it's shown that you've failed to comply with these site safety inspections in this program as we continue to move forward. And I think that would definitely help change some people's mindsets throughout the course of things. If they know that there's a risk that for some reason that the job site may get stopped, or the ongoing progress at the job site may get stopped, I'm sure that there are some folks that would definitely maybe have safety more in the front of their mind than in the back of their mind.
Yeah, I'm the administrator of the Construction Fire Safety Coalition, so I track the larger construction fires all around the country. And I can
Uh-huh.
tell you, Boston has been ahead of the curve on the whole construction fire safety thing. They even issue their own hot work permits. That
Oh.
and I think that program is spread to all of Massachusetts, but it's the only state that I know of where the municipality issues the hot work permit, and it's not a sort of a self-contained within the builder superintendent sort of situation.
Yeah, I think that would be difficult to, like you mentioned, having a division of 60 people and just being able to stay on top of what you currently have, let alone trying to then issue those hot work permits and staying on top of all the hot work associated with it. Now, granted, that is one of the challenges and one of the risks that we see
Mhm.
at new construction sites. I'd be interested to see how that program is going and how effective and how able able to get out there and kind of take a look at it and make sure that they're following through with those permits.
Yeah,
So,
it would be a heavy lift for a lot of departments who have trouble
yeah,
keeping up with their regular inspections. That's why it's designed to be an in-house thing. So at least
yeah,
whoever the fire prevention program manager or site safety director, at least they would know where hot work is occurring, when it's occurring, and the duration of the hot work, so they can go check back up on it. Because one of the biggest problems with hot work is that you're supposed to have a fire watch where they
hmm,
do no other duties. Their only duty is
right.
to sit there and watch where that slag goes and man the fire extinguisher. But construction managers hate people standing around doing nothing. So they'll try
Yeah,
to have them sweep up or do something, which is
right,
not what the code says.
right.
And sometimes even if sometimes they don't even have a fire watch. I was giving
Hmm.
a talk on construction fire safety of all things in Columbus, Ohio. This was 2 years ago, and or a year ago, and they were renovating the Hilton, what is now the Hilton Tower.
Okay.
And I was coming back from dinner, and it was pitch black, and I look up, and there's somebody doing hot work. They were doing welding on the side of this building, and you could see the slag bouncing off the sides of the building. And once in a while, they would stop and shine a flashlight to see if anything caught fire. And that's the kind of foolish things that
Yeah,
builders will do to get caught up. And if they're not vigilant about it, their employees will do it on their own. And
yeah.
even though this was a Type 1 building, the whole side of it had a temporary plywood wall of
Hmm.
20 stories,
Wow.
and this hot work was right around the
Yeah.
corner.
That is super risky. Like you
Yeah.
said, doing it at night, having to stop the work. He's probably one employee out there doing the work himself, and then being able to shine the light to see, what's happening. By the time you see something, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to mitigate it quickly enough to be able to stop it from growing. So,
Yeah, the NFPA report that Richard Campbell put out in 2020, uh, all these fires occur between 4 o'clock and midnight, most of them, and
hmm,
between midnight and 4 a.m., 12% of the fires occur, but it accounts for like 70% of the property loss because
yeah,
nobody's here. The other thing is the training of employees. I don't think employees are doing a lot of this stuff out of spite or malice. I think they're just doing out
Right.
of ignorance. I think the fire service and the building departments overestimate people's fire safety literacy. There's been a cultural change in the workforce. Uh, Many of the folks on construction sites don't even know to call 911. You know,
Hmm.
if you grew up here and you were in American public schools, you know, every October you got that fire safety training, call 911 and
Yep.
everything else that goes along with it. And there's folks on these construction sites nowadays who come from places where you just don't call the government if you have a
Hmm.
problem. And a prime example of this was up in New Jersey. There was a fire. They were doing hot work, unpermitted hot work in a wall cavity, and they heard crackling. So do they call 911? No, they go to lunch. So then they come back and they smell smoke. They call 911? No, they call their boss, who doesn't answer the first time. And the way the fire department was notified of the fire is the fire burned in the shaft space or interstitial space through a sprinkler pipe, which set a water flow alarm off. But by that time, it was in all the walls. There was nothing in the fire. It was game over because it didn't have early
Right.
notification.
Yeah. And really a fire sprinkler system is not designed to be able to protect the interstitial space of that wall cavity. So
No.
thankfully, at least it burned through that. Maybe if it was CPVC or something along those lines, to be able to burn through that and at least start to cool the fire enough. But yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have known. And once the water flow alarm, then that would we would know. And I would imagine that was probably, like you said, they went to lunch and called a couple people, but it was more delay. And by then, it's like, hey, are we going to be able to get there soon enough to be able to put the fire out?
Well, there was a bad fire in College Park, Maryland, a couple of years ago. It was a big residential property, podium style construction. And the fire marshal told me they found 12 expended fire extinguishers at the point of origin. So
Wow.
that's another training issue.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to give people extinguishers, you have to train them. And the biggest part of extinguisher training is when not to use them. You
Yeah.
know, if you
Yep.
can't put it out with one extinguisher, you're not going to put it
Mhm.
out with 12. And all you're doing is
Yeah.
wasting time.
Yeah.
And the other part about that was that the standpipe, while it went up with the building, had a bunch of open valves in it. You know, and so when the fire department pulled up and charged the standpipe, they thought they were going to go water on the top floor, and they didn't.
Hmm.
So
Because
the
losing
local
it.
fire,
Yeah.
yeah, because they had a standpipe, but it had a sprinkler system not turned on. Because nowadays that's another common theme is you have sprinkler systems, the place is buttoned up, it's conditioned, but they don't want to
Right.
turn on the sprinkler system because they're worried about water damage. And
Yeah.
the number one claim for insurance companies is water damage not from flooding. That's the number one claim. And to mitigate that hazard, insurance companies have jacked up the deductible on water
Oh.
damage claims. So this is a disincentive for the builders to turn the
Hmm.
water on until they hand the building over to the owner, and then the standard policy kicks in.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might be something that we need to work with, the insurance agency or insurance industry as well, to talk about that as it relates back to water damage as part of fire suppression or at least some fire protection in these structures, at when they're the most vulnerable. So,
Absolutely. I mean, once you get the JIT board on and the sprinkler system on,
mhm.
those structures are as safe as any other
Yeah,
structure. It's just, you figure the life cycle of a building of that nature is probably 40 to 60 years, and the construction takes place in less than a year. So you got
yeah,
less than 1% of the life cycle of that building where it's vulnerable and needs to be protected. And you
yeah.
would think that you could. I've tried to engage the insurance industry on this particular issue. I sat on a panel discussion at an insurance conference last year, and basically, they can't come out and say it, but if they're too hard on the insured, then they'll just go to their competitor.
Mm,
So they have to walk that fine line of
yeah,
protecting, you know, their investment, but at the same time, not scare off the business to a
right.
competitor. Now, in England, I did a talk there this past May, and I was interested to find out that the insurance companies are the ones who regulate construction, fire
Hmm.
safety. In fact, their standard, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, is put together by the insurance industry. It's not put together by code developers or code promulgators. The insurance industry got together, created this manual, and all of them agreed If you want us to underwrite your policy, then you have to follow this manual, and they all agree across the board on it. So
Wow.
their approach is completely opposite our approach.
Yeah, that's
It's all
definitely
put on the regulators.
yeah, that's definitely a different perspective because normally, we as, and I hate to use the term enforcers, it's kind of put on us to be able to make sure that they're following through with the codes and standards. But there isn't, it does incentivize building owners and it does incentivize general contractors if it's driven by, those that are going to, potentially pay a claim should something happen. So,
Yeah, I
um,
absolutely agree.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of a unique process. And I would be interested to hear, like, other places throughout the globe and how they do things. I know that there's a lot of places, ICC's got a global, office now. They're definitely, I talked to Judy Zakreski and, they're working on trying to grow and develop, some of these building codes and standards across the globe to be able to help improve building safety. And I wonder, as they start to talk about these things and maybe they review some of these new construction fire safety requirements and how others are doing it. I think that there's ways that we can learn here in the United States, because I think that that's what we all try to do. And even here in the fire service, we always are borrowing from other agencies that may be doing something just a little bit
Hmm.
better than what we're doing. We do it all the time. So, but now we talk a little bit about the plan earlier. What are some important elements to include in that plan? I mean, I know that 241 has examples, but I know everybody has things just a little bit different. I like you mentioned the Construction Fire Safety Coalition. I went to that website yesterday, and there's even guides there that people can take and use to be
Yes.
able to develop their plan. But what are some important elements to include in that plan?
Well, I talked about, good housekeeping. And I gave the
Hmm.
story about when I renovated my house in South Baltimore that I pulled down a duct to replace a duct, and there was a Taco Bell bag in there. And I surmised that whoever did the renovations before me probably was the outside contractor, and they were eating lunch, and they didn't want to go find a trash can, so they just shoved it in the duct. And
Hmm.
that's this little townhouse in South Baltimore. Now, look at a big construction site where they might have 30 minutes for lunch. So you think they're going to run around and look for a? No, they're going to stick it in an open shaft, which is coincidentally the same places people put cigarettes when they
Yeah.
don't want to be caught smoking. On-site security, you should have a plan for that. You should have a section on fire protection systems and their disposition. The other thing about the safety plan that I want to emphasize is people think, okay, we'll put this plan together and it'll go sit on a shelf. It's
Hmm.
supposed to be a living document that changes as the sequence of construction changes, as inventory moves around the building. A lot of times you'll have a finished floor, and they will take the building material, move it to another floor
Hmm.
or parking garage that's finished. You want to talk about training of employees. They should have some training on bigger construction sites. They do, and they usually give people a sticker for their helmet. And you can't go on the construction site
Hmm.
unless you have the sticker that you got the training. You want to develop the pre-fire plan in conjunction with the fire department. You know how we were talking about the fire service not getting out to these construction sites. Well, you know, the builders should start reaching out to the local firehouse
Hmm.
and say, "You're the closest firehouse to this construction site. We want you to come on, the site, show you the entrance. If it's locked, here's where the key box is, which is required now, by the way.
Yep.
This is where the command post is going to be if something were to happen. Here's all our contact information. But that doesn't happen. We want to talk about rapid communications. Train your employees to call. Early notification is a key. Any kind of special hazards you want to identify in the plan. And to give you an example of that, when I was the chief building inspector for Prince George's County, Maryland, they were building a power plant, and I had never been involved in the building of a power plant. Well, every power plant has a turbine and a
Hmm.
switch yard, and the
Yep.
switch yard got energized before the power plant was fully online. And the switch yard is
Okay.
basically like a traffic cop that directs electric in different directions. And this switch yard was energized, and it had outbuildings in the switch yard. Nobody could enter the switch yard while that switch yard was energized, especially not throwing water. So we
Right.
had to have special procedure for shutting down that switch yard. And I can assure you, it's not like flipping a light switch. That sent
Right.
power to DC, Central Maryland, Southern Maryland. So we had to have a procedure to shut that down as quickly as possible so the fire department could enter and extinguish any fires. Never had to
Hmm.
happen, but you planned for it.
Yeah.
You want to plan for um, protection of exposures.
Hmm.
Like down in Charlotte, they had that massive construction fire that actually killed 2 workers, which is unusual because construction site fires usually don't kill people. Um, but there was another project maybe 80 feet away from it, wood exposed. They were also building another building. And the
Hmm.
Charlotte Fire Department did a great job stopping that fire at just the fire building. And that other building, other than the Tyvex melting off of the face of it, no other damage. So, fire departments need to start developing a plan for exposure protection. The plan should, like I said, I told you, this should include organizational structure
Yep.
of the construction company or who the fire
Yep.
program manager is. Um, if it's a complex structure or a structure that's important to the community, like a hospital or school, they probably should have a risk assessment done by an FPE.
Hmm.
Um, you know,
Now, do you recommend? Yeah, I know that there are companies out there that do construction safety plans. Is that a recommendation that maybe working with those companies to help develop these plans, at least initially, and submit them with their building set, or do you think that they can do this independently?
well, it depends on the size and complexity of the structure. If you're going to spend, I think that the job in the construction site that caught fire in Fairfax a year and a half, 2 years ago, I think it was valued at like $55 million. So if you're going
Wow.
to spend $55 million on a complex, you can't spend another 20 or 30 grand to get an FPE to do a
Hmm.
comprehensive risk assessment and a plan for you. But the code says that you have you have to have a fire safety plan for all projects. It doesn't say big ones; it says
Right.
all. So
Yep.
even, I mean, technically, if John Q. Public builds a deck on his house, he's supposed to have a plan. Now, I don't know. You could scope it any way you want. Maybe a one pager would be fine,
Yeah.
but you're supposed to have them. And this is the thing with the 2021 edition of the ISC. It is supposed to go in with the initial submission. It
Hmm.
is a building permit is not to be issued unless an approved fire safety plan is on file. And I
Hmm.
think that's a great code change, especially because being a building official and a fire official, I know that they will do backflips to get that building permit.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But once they put shovels in the dirt, then getting anything out of them is like getting blood out of a turnip, you know. So
Yeah.
so that's if they just enforce what's on the books, that would be
Yeah.
adequate.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that, like you mentioned, it's probably a wide range depending on the complexity of the project. Do you always need to have a design professional be able to develop a construction safety plan? Probably not, but maybe on some of these larger projects where there's more complexity and there's special features, I would even think maybe like buildings that are partially occupied because we do have tenant improvements and those types of things. I
Well,
think
yeah, I would
that might be a good
definitely.
thing too.
Yeah, phased occupancy is a challenge always, and the
Hmm.
code really doesn't address it.
Yeah.
And on that, the Construction Fire Safety Coalition, I have to go back and look. I did have a model policy from a Canadian building department on what they needed for phased occupancy. I know in Baltimore City, we had to they had to have at least an hour separation between the
Mm.
construction and the occupied parts, and they also had to have all of the fire protection systems online in the occupied areas,
Yep.
sprinklers, the whole works, the fire alarm, that kind of thing. Because you're always going to come up against phased occupancy because
Yep.
nobody wants to build a 20-story apartment building and not be able to start occupying it until the last unit's finished, or a hotel,
Right.
you
Right.
know.
Yeah, and it happens all the time, right? I mean, we always are getting temporary occupancy or partial temporary occupancy requests to be able to start occupying those things, and it's important that they continue to follow the construction safety plan because I think now that you've got people in there that may not necessarily be nearly as aware as some of the hazards associated with the construction and like hot work and those types of things that may pose a risk to them if they're in that building and something should happen.
And the other thing people forget is they should have an evacuation plan.
Hmm.
You have to have one for a finished building,
Yeah.
for high rises anyway, and there should be no difference. It should be in fact during construction, it's more of a need for evacuation planning because things are constantly changing. And then the people that are in the building, you need to know how many construction workers are in there or whatever. Fortunately, there haven't been too many incidents where that was an issue because of usually they're not occupying when the fires happen. Fire in
Right.
Charlotte was different. It was a bad set of facts there, really an outlier when it comes to how construction fires start. And the only real takeaway, I don't see that really being replicated around the country like you see other types of fires on construction sites. Um, but I think the big takeaway from the Charlotte fire was if you have a piece of equipment that's running that
Hmm.
has the potential to malfunction and start a fire, that equipment should be attended. And
Yeah.
there it was a spray installation machine um, that they were spraying foam on every floor, and that machine malfunctioned and caught fire, and that's why you had rapid fire spray because it was basically shooting embers out on every floor at the same time.
Jeez. Yeah, a very bad scenario there. Now, fire prevention program managers, a lot of times it may be the general contractor, um, but maybe on some of these larger sites, I would imagine that maybe they have some more safety personnel that kind of monitor all those types of areas and those types of things. But what type of training? We always talk about training and the need for training, and I even think that there are some agencies that require training for their fire prevention program managers. But what type of training is out there for people that may need that?
The code actually says whoever the site safety director, fire prevention program manager, depends what code you're using, what they're called, but they're the same position. It says
Hmm.
basically the code is vague here. It says they have to have training that is in conjunction with their roles and responsibilities on the job site, and uh, so there's no certification out there. But I will say that the National Association of State Fire Marshals has a self-paced online program. I don't know if you remember a couple years ago when the IFC had the crowd manager
Oh yeah.
uh,
Yep.
uh, requirement, and there was no set training. So I
Hmm.
think it started with the state of Maryland. The Maryland State Fire Marshal put an online self-paced training program, and then that was picked up by NAVSM as a whole, and they
Yep.
put it online. They did the same thing using a FEMA grant to do for construction fire safety. So that would
Okay.
be the place to go. And we're trying to work with the National Association of State Fire Marshals to help them uh, get that updated and raring to go. But
Yeah.
there's no single
I
clearinghouse, I'll put it that way, other than those
Okay.
guys.
And I would imagine that the training has to get updated. I wouldn't say necessarily with each code cycle, but maybe that might be something that you take a look at, either code cycle or standard cycle, because there are going to be new elements that are going to need to be complied with and at least educated on, and
Well,
trying to make sure to keep that updated.
yeah, I got to review all their stuff, and they haven't geared towards the fire inspectors. They have one
Mm,
geared towards first responders, but they also have them geared towards workers and
okay.
construction site managers. So it's tailored to the audience. And at the end, you get a certificate. It's not a certification, but it's a certificate. So
Yep.
you can at least prove you had that, and maybe put it in a construction trailer. So when the fire or building inspector come by, they said, who's your fire prevention program manager, and you point to so and so, and there's the training that he's gotten or she's gotten.
We talk, we've kind of talked so far in this conversation about the challenges. We've talked about elements of the plan and the fire prevention program manager. Those are all probably good practices to be able to engage in. But as we take a look at it, we haven't really necessarily talked too much about, the workers themselves and some of the safety practices that they can implement to be able to promote fire safety. So what are some best practices that, as we're out, let's say I go out to a job site or a building inspector goes out to a job site, and being able to talk to, contractors and workers about best practices, safety practices, and to be able to keep that job site a little safer.
Well, one is fire department access.
Hmm.
That the code requires 20 feet of unobstructed width, 13 and a half feet of unobstructed height, and that is unobstructed. That's not a 20-foot road with vehicles on either side of it. I
Hmm.
was lucky enough when I was in Rockville. I had one of my inspectors was a volunteer firefighter, so he was conscious of fire safety and access. And if he saw roll off dumpster blocking a hydrant, or anything that would impede fire department access. He would shut the job down until they moved everything. Not a lot of people have the luxury of having a building inspector that's a volunteer firefighter, but
Right.
they impress upon the employees that they have a responsibility to report all potential fire hazards. So they need
Mm-hmm.
to have training on segregating fuel sources from potential ignition sources. Um, Observe all fire safety rules themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and use tools safely and hazmat safely and store them safely. I was on a construction site up in New Jersey that caught fire. It was two garden apartments, and one was burned, one was unburned. And I walked through the one that was unburned, and I saw electrical violations. All branch circuits should originate in the same board with a cutoff. They had branch circuits that were tapping off at outlets. They had open splices. They had wires that weren't supported every 10 feet, like the code says, even for temporary wiring. And the kicker was they had a container of mineral spirits, which was highly flammable,
Mm-hmm.
and they must have lost the cap. So they shoved napkins and a rubber glove in the opening as a makeshift cap, which basically created a wick. And that was
Yeah.
on a temporary OSB table with all trash and debris. In Bound Brook, New Jersey, instead of having a dumpster, they took one of the units and made it a scrap room. So I guess that was going to be the last unit to be finished. And when the arsonist walked up, to the first floor of wood, he happened to walk into the scrap room. He already had the
Yeah.
gasoline, so he had all
Yeah.
the fuel in the world right then and there. That was
Yeah.
poor site security as well. He just pushed
Yeah.
a weighted base fence aside and walked right up into the structure.
Well, and I think we've been focusing a lot on maybe accidental causes and, the causes associated with maybe the activities being engaged in, but we haven't really talked a lot about maybe those that, the arsonists or those incendiary type fires and being able to, security is obviously a must, but that goes to show you the importance of just general housekeeping.
Yeah, housekeeping can get out of control because no construction manager ever gets paid extra for a clean job site. And
Yeah.
and in the case of the College Park fire, they surmised that somebody was smoking and they dropped a cigarette down an open shaft so they wouldn't be caught with a cigarette butt. And there was also trash and debris in that same shaft which burned up. Now, there's a fire in 40 Upper Rock in Rockville. It actually was so bad it closed I-270. It made CNN because it's a major artery going in and out of DC. That was
Wow.
started because of there was a bunch of trash and debris left in an upper floor. They had a heater that was never turned off rather. It was heating all the debris, caught it on fire, burned it into the roof, which had a dry system. Good news, right? Nope, it was turned off. It wasn't turned on. Otherwise, it would have never been a news story. And they had
Right.
a guard service, but guard services don't work if they don't patrol. And this guard
Right.
service didn't patrol; they just sat in the booth. I mean, any one of these things, you know, if the heater's turned off, the fire doesn't happen. If there's no
Right.
trash and debris in the room, the fire doesn't happen. If the
Right.
guard patrols like they should, the fire doesn't get big enough to do $40 million of damage.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those factors. If one of those factors would have changed, we would have had a much different outcome. And I think you kind of hit on it earlier, perspective. I think you said something about we overestimate people's awareness as it relates back to fire safety. And I think that being in this industry for as long as I have, and I'm sure you have as well. I mean, we all know the right things to do, but and it's second nature to us, but it's not necessarily on the forefront of everybody's mind all the time.
Yeah, I've told all the stories of failure. I at least feel obligated to tell a success story, and
Yeah.
but you never know about the success stories
You never
because they
hear
never
them.
make the news. Yeah,
Yeah.
I happened to be up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I was up there talking with the fire service and talking about construction fire safety, and they told me about this captain that's in the fire prevention office that has a real thing for construction site fire safety, and he takes it upon himself to go out every day and go to different construction sites, take pictures, send the pictures to the local firehouse, let them know the disposition of the fire protection systems and all that stuff. And they thought he was a little bit fanatical until a fire came in on the upper floor of one of these construction sites, and the fire department, that local fire company, knew that the dry system was installed, hooked into the FDC, but not turned on. So
Mm.
all they did, they showed up, they hooked up to the FDC, put the fire out, never made the news. Nobody even would have known about it if they hadn't have told me. And I was given a class up in Massachusetts 2 years ago and met the guy.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's wild. Yeah, like you just said, we nobody would have ever known these things, because you don't hear about the success stories because they typically, they don't grow big enough that they make any type of headline.
Yeah, and nobody thinks they're ever going to have a fire because
Right.
most
Yeah.
Americans don't ever see fire regularly on a large scale
Right.
in their private lives. And I always say this story to give you an illustration about it. When I was the fire marshal in Baltimore City, if we had a fatal fire and we went on the news about smoke alarms, we would get a slight uptick in smoke alarm
Hmm.
installation requests. Slight.
Yep.
If we had a carbon monoxide poisoning, we would get inundated with calls because to people, the carbon monoxide threat was more real to them than the fire threat, even though the numbers don't bear that out. More Americans die
Yeah.
in fires every year than every natural disaster combined, and
Yeah.
especially a lot more so than CO. So it's perception. How you change that, I don't know, but nobody thinks we're
Yeah.
gonna have a fire. So
Yep.
and also we use fire on a small scale every day.
Yeah.
Whether it's to light a
Heat
candle
your
or to cook your
homes.
food,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
so it's you kind of let your guard down. And
Yeah.
on construction sites, fires don't really hurt people too often. It's less than like
Right.
1.5% of all injuries. The
Yep.
present dangers on construction sites is what OSHA calls the fatal four: electrocution, struck by hazards, fall from height, and caught in
Hmm.
between. And construction sites do a great job at mitigating those hazards because they're
Yeah.
real to them. And
Yeah.
fire hazards is sort of, we'll be okay.
Yeah, it's more about that perception, and it's one of those things. How do you change that perception? And I think if anybody is able to successfully do that, that they're going to be better for it. I do think that one of the things that we have in the fire service, we've been successful in being able to reduce a lot of the risk associated with fire. Building codes and standards have definitely done a lot of good in being able to reduce and minimize the risk associated with fire, but that's still out there. It's still present. And I think because you don't see the headlines, the attention grabbing headlines is like probably what we did, in the early parts of the century. I think it, probably helps kind of shape that perception. There's a lot more complacency associated with fire safety. So, but hopefully we can figure that out as time goes on. Now, part of the plan also includes fire protection features, and we've talked about standpipes and those types of things. One of the areas that I saw is they use the use of air horns because being able to provide some type of notification to those people that are on the job site. Is that part of like a standard, or is that just something that maybe somebody out there is thinking, hey, we don't have an active alarm system, so we're going to use air horns as our alarm system?
Well, I thought I heard it all, but that's a new one on me. But
Yeah.
the thing is there's technology out there so that you would have an alarm system. Now, I'm
Hmm.
not advocating for any particular company, but there are companies that have wireless temporary alarm systems, um, and the sensors themselves can scan for up to 12 or 15 or 20 channels of data, including heat rays of rise, smoke, humidity, and these things usually can be attached to anything. They have magnets and hooks and straps, and they're all Wi-Fi enabled and battery powered. So you can have a temporary alarm system, and it wouldn't be cost prohibitive for the builder because they could take them from one job to the next job to the next job,
Hmm.
and because they're all Wi-Fi enabled, um, you could send that. Say you could set certain parameters if the heat gets above so much, if it detects smoke, that it can go right to 911, or it goes right to the project manager, or wherever you want it to go. Anybody's tablet or smartphone that you
Hmm.
want. The
I haven't even
technology is
heard.
out there.
Yeah, I hadn't even heard of that. That's a new one to me. And like you just said, being able to take it from job site to job site, it's lack of better term, recyclable. I mean, it is things that you can definitely reuse, especially if there is any worry about the cost. Because I would imagine that those items aren't necessarily particularly inexpensive, but if you can reuse them, I think that would lead to some success.
And I think you can rent them as well. That would
Yeah.
be, that big cost up front. I Like I said, I'm not advocating for any particular company, but if you went to Space Age Technologies website, you could see
Okay.
examples of those. And the reason I bring them up is they're the ones I see at the conferences.
Yeah. And I know that some of that they're, I work a lot with those guys or talk to those guys at different conferences, because a lot of those guys are here in California as well. But so we kind of talk about temporary systems and managing those temporary systems, but we know that how those can definitely start fires. But how can we effectively manage those and effectively use those without compromising fire safety?
Of the temporary systems that are installed.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
first off, your temporary electric needs to be installed per the code. And
Hmm.
there is a code that governs it. Just like I said a couple of things earlier about branch circuits. They also have to have overcurrent protection. Lights cannot be just dangled by the wire unless they're
Hmm.
designed to be. Um,
Yeah.
the wire should be supported, that kind of thing. Hazmats should be stored like the standards say they should be stored. Other temporary systems you see besides electric is, I mean, a lot of like emergency generators.
Yep.
If they're not, those just need to have the proper clearances. There was a fire up in New England where they had an emergency generator. The exhaust actually caused the fire because it gets a hot exhaust. So I'm just not a big fan of running equipment unattended. So I
Yeah.
think that
Yep.
the good, but once again, no construction manager wants to sit someone to stare at a piece of equipment.
Right.
It
Yep.
drives them nuts. They want all hands on deck.
Yeah, yeah. Like you just said, they earlier they want to come in under budget and they want to come in, ahead of schedule. That's a lot of what we and as a fire code official, I'm sure you could probably have stories about applicants that are very driven to be able to obtain their occupancy and are and trying to do everything they can to be able to obtain that occupancy, because a lot of times we're getting close to that when that contract is up, and so they're very driven, and so they're going to do everything they can to kind of keep things moving along.
They have powerful incentives to get done early and powerful disincentives and penalties if they go over time and budget.
Hmm.
So the fire
Yeah.
safety gets lost in their priorities.
Yeah. Now, I've got just a couple questions left, and probably the next question would be areas for improvement as we talk about terms in the terms of construction fire safety, but areas that we can continue to improve and work with our stakeholders and address the challenges. I think that I do think that we do, although that there are challenges out there, I think that most people want to do the right thing to be able to get us to where we need to go. But what are some key areas that you see we can improve upon and be able to further develop?
You mean we as the fire service or building
No, I
officials
would say
or
more just as in general, like let's say anywhere from codes and standards to the process as a whole to be able to help improve construction fire safety.
I'm I think there are enough codes on the book to cover it. If we just followed the code and enforced the codes that are on the books, and it doesn't matter to me if it's ISC jurisdiction because ISC Chapter 33 still references NFP 241. It's
Hmm.
actually in there. It basically says anything we didn't cover, the 241 covers. You got to follow too. Um, and it's just a matter of uh, the political will to staff fire marshal's office and building departments. You rarely see uh, fire marshal's offices and building departments that have a unit that just does construction. Now, Boston has one, New York has one. I'm not sure about Chicago. Denver has one, but they're the outliers. They're not the
Hmm.
norm, and it takes money to staff it. And when you're cutting back on budgets, you're not going to take fire engines off the street. You're going to cut the people and staff and behind the scenes. So that's a big thing. I mean, you can go back to 1972, America Burning, that says that 5% of a total fire department budget should go to fire prevention. And
Hmm.
and I can tell you when I was in Baltimore, I crunched those numbers and they gave us one penny on the dollar. It was barely
Hmm.
1%, even though we generated enough revenue to pay for ourselves through permit
Right.
fees.
Yeah.
So that's a biggie. I think enforcing site security, I think fire departments kind of and building departments think, oh, that's a cop thing. You know, Site
Hmm.
security is there to keep them from stealing stuff. Wrong. It's to keep bad actors out.
Yeah.
I always say they always put up a fence after the fire. They had a fire
Yeah.
in Long Neck, Delaware, down here in my neck of the woods. I went over to see it. There were three garden apartments, and one of them caught fire. And I was talking to the state fire marshal's office, and they had theorized that someone came out of the tree line, which was directly behind the house or the
Hmm.
apartment building, went in the back door, and for whatever reason set a fire. There's a lot of reasons why. I said, well, what do you think it was? And they said it probably was drugs because that area of Delaware is the Long Neck, Delaware. He said was the opioid addiction
Mm.
ground zero for Sussex County, Delaware. So people on drugs, they do weird things. And in fact, Avalon Bay, when they did their risk assessment, security risk assessment, they would go to the CDC map in Atlanta for opioid addiction, and that would factor into how much security they would put
Oh,
on their
wow.
job site. You know, and a simple fence would have kept that out. Um,
Yeah.
Sometimes people scrap copper, so they'll steal the copper wiring and then they'll burn the wiring insulation off right on site before they leave, and they don't put the fire out, or they just go in there for
Right.
warmth or any number of
Yeah.
reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. So building, it sounds like the site security is definitely one of those big areas of improvement that we all need to, start working towards. And I know some of the larger job sites, not typically a concern, but I do know of others that may not necessarily have that same level of security. So. Now we talked a lot about different tools and different areas that people can gain more information. But where can they find out more information about the Construction Fire Safety Coalition and maybe some of those other tools that you mentioned in our podcast? And I'll definitely include links to all of that stuff in the show notes so people can access those. But where can they find more information if they're going to seek more information out?
Yeah, www.constructionfiresafety.org. That's the website to the Construction Fire Safety Coalition. Go, see what we have to offer, and don't be shy if you see something not on there that you would expect to see on there. Uh, I'm really good at not reinventing the wheel, so
Hmm.
I have a lot of fire department contacts around the country. So if there's something not on there that you would expect to be on there, give me a holler, and I'll look around and see if somebody has a policy on it or a checklist or
Yep.
something. We are trying to develop, and hopefully in 2024 we're going to develop an app that will
Oh,
aid in the daily self-inspection. Because the IFC requires a daily self-inspection, NFPA 241 requires a weekly self-inspection. And if you have somebody that wants to complain that, oh, I got to create a form, blah blah blah, it will just be an app for a smartphone or a tablet,
yeah.
and they would just go around and just check, what they checked, and maybe a space for a narrative, and then they could
Right.
save it to their own file as a PDF. So hopefully that'll be online in early to mid 2024, and it actually would be it's meant for a builder, but it wouldn't be a bad tool for a firefighter or fire inspector when they get
Yeah.
out on site, just to give them a reminder of what to look for.
Yeah, that app kind of reminds me a lot. A lot of different agencies are using electronic record repositories for your fire
Yeah.
protection equipment. It kind of sounds a lot like that. And if there was like a central repository where we could go and we could look that up before we maybe go to a job site, I think that would be extremely helpful. So,
Yeah, this is the area. Construction fire safety is definitely an area where a lot of more education and awareness needs. Because
yeah.
I always say, what is predictable is preventable. And until last week, until the other day when I went to Charlotte, that was one I couldn't have predicted. But every other job site I've ever been on that caught fire was very predictable and very preventable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hope that that was definitely very tragic, and I hope that we no longer, yeah, I hope we never face that again. It's one of those things that, as I consider it, being a fire safety professional, a lot of the things that we try to do is we try to prevent the avoidable if at all
Yes.
possible, and so if there's ways that we can do that, and that's why this podcast for me is essential because then we can share that message to other building and fire safety professionals, so that way they can be more exposed to it, because I think that these conversations are essential to know what's out there and know what's going on. And as you mentioned, if we don't know if you don't maybe have a tool on the website, there might be somebody else that's using it. And I think that our community as a whole will definitely benefit from having more conversations and discussions, especially on topics like this.
Yeah, at constructionfiresafety.org, we have just one click and you get the whole fire service toolkit on construction
Hmm.
site. Basically, you could create your own program
Yeah.
from some of the forms and documents and model policies in that toolkit. But there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done in this area.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited for the future, and hopefully we can continue to move forward. Well, Ray, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we close this episode?
Well, I do give a class on construction fire safety. It's called Codes that Safeguard Construction. It's meant for a wide audience. We do it free of charge, and we are an ICC preferred provider. So if you have any
Okay.
ICC certifications, I do a class on that, and then classes more on wood construction, like tall mass timber and those kind of things. And this is completely free training. We get ourselves there. I teach and put myself up and go. So it's pretty good ICC preferred provider resource.
Well, I know that my chapter is always looking for training, so I will definitely share that. And I know that you know some of my counterparts here in the state of California, so I'll definitely share that with them as well because we're always looking for training and good training that will definitely on topics that are important that are very relevant to what we do every day. So. All right. Well, Ray, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being a guest on ICC Region 1 Radio. And yeah, until next time.
Thank you.